This is an especially wonderful evening for me because I had the privilege of reviewing Jane's book for the New York Times. And I can tell you, reviewing a book, it's like tearing it apart and then putting it back together and finding the essence. And in the back of my mind, I was saying, this should be called No Ordinary Woman, because Jane seemed to her life story is unlike any I had read. And I wanted to Jane to go over how she was raised on a farm in Northern Ireland, nowhere Northern Ireland, during the last of the Troubles, parents who were the opposite of loving and supportive. But you have this one fairy godmother, your Aunt Fanny, and she seems to be the bridge from your childhood to your career. Can you explain that? Because I think it's fascinating.
Sure. Well, I was kind of raised, in this sort of pretty rough house farmyard farm with 3 siblings. There was 4 kids, 2 parents. It was pretty chaotic. It was very cold and a pretty troubled childhood. But part of that framework was that very often me and my siblings would be sort of sent off to basically distant relatives, perhaps at the summer, perhaps at the weekend. And I had a great aunt. She was married to my grandmother's cousin, so it was a very, very extended family. And we used to spend a lot of time there. And her best friend was a woman called Fanny Marr. And so Fanny became this honorary aunt. She had a small. She lived in a house in Belfast, but she had a small fisherman's cottage by the ocean, in County Down. And I used to spend every summer there. She loved kids. She'd never married, didn't have kids of her own. She was an elderly lady, and she used to take care of me over the summers. Occasionally, especially as my sisters grew up and moved out, and I was kind of alone. And Aunt Fanny was almost, looking back, like a life mentor. Like, she would show me love. She taught me to play Scrabble. She, taught me to write letters. She really encouraged me to read. She talked to me about the wider world. She was sort of very gently mothering me as I was growing up, and basically, spending as much time as I could with her, as a sort of almost kind of emotional bulwark against a really rough childhood in my home. In the end, as I became an adult, and I write about this in the book, Fanny wrote me at a moment in my life when I just sort of gotten spat out the other end of the education system and didn't have any money, that the world's economy was sort of starting to crumble, couldn't get a job out of college, was really kind of struggling to figure out how I was going to make this sort of dream of being a journalist come true. And one day, out of the blue, Fanny, who and I, who would constantly write each other letters, enclosed in a letter to me a check. It was £3,000 sterling, so about $4,500 at the time, and said, do with this something fun. And I very, very quickly used it to fly to Yemen to study Arabic.
Which I love that part, that's what you considered fun. And it clearly was tied to that childhood-based dream to be a broadcast journalist. And the turning point in for the first part of it, you then find yourself in Dubai. And that's the next stage. And that's, it seems to be very generational, that a lot of journalists, no matter what nationality, end up in Dubai. Mm-hmm. What happened there?
Well, I was a youngster. This is my first ever paying job. So I studied in Yemen for as long as I could until I was down to my last dollar. And then I responded to an advertisement that said, there were English language newspaper was looking for any kind of staff, sub-editors, anybody who was native English speaker and would be willing to move to Dubai. And I thought, well, it's not exactly Jerusalem or Baghdad or like a big, important news hub as I would have thought of at the time in 2008, but it was a paying job in the Middle East. So I applied and I got the job and I went there. I was thrilled at first. It was exciting. I was 23. I was getting paid to be a sort of journalist. I was working in this massive newsroom that was filled with people from all over the world, which was very cool for me. And I worked on the sports desk as a sub-editor. So I was correcting spelling mistakes and kind of trying to, we used to use the software to try to squish because this was a printed newspaper at the time, I mean, there was a website, but no one was ever on it. And so I would sort of read articles on the sports section, of which I had no idea what was happening. I knew nothing about cricket. And I would then have to chop the bottom bit off to fit it on the page. I eventually got given a job as a business writer, which was obviously not really a beat that I was terribly interested in, but it was a job with a byline, and that was very, very exciting for me. So that was really how I got started. And I was new. I was part of that generation where there was opportunities in Dubai. If you couldn't, there were jobs there, and it may not have been the Arab Street as we know it, but it was in the Middle East. So it felt like at least a step forward.
And then you had your road to Damascus moment.
Yes, I did. I mean, it's so easy. You grow up with this dream, and it's very easy. No one sits down and has a big conversation with themselves, I think, and like gives up on their dream officially and just sits on a park bench and decides. I just think you compromise and you compromise and you compromise. And I do have sometimes a bit of an uncompromising personality. And I just kept seeing myself living this very nice life in Dubai. I rented a nice apartment with a friend, and I had a really nice car, and I had a nice, easy job, easy compared with what I went on to do. And just sort of opportunities kept popping up, and a promotion here and opportunities there. And it just wasn't what I wanted to do. I was constantly haunted by the fact that I thought I was going to be off like, one like Kate Adie in the BBC and I really wanted to work in broadcasting, and I really, really wanted to cover like the biggest stories of the day and travel the world and cover conflict. And I was sent to cover the launch of a new Mazda car in one of those big showrooms, and it's pretty close to the airport. And it sounds sort of bratty now to be like, oh, I was so upset that I had to do this. And it wasn't that the work was patronizing to me, because don't forget, I was a kid with no experience. I was very lucky to have this job, but it just wasn't what I had dreamed of for my life. And it felt like these dreams that I was working my way towards in Yemen and when I first moved to Dubai had sort of stalled. And I just didn't recognize who I was. And I just left. I stayed as long as I needed to. I did these interviews. I just walked out, and I went to the airport, which is where it was Terminal 2 in Dubai. It's still the same situation, where that's where all the flights go to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, like regional, and a lot of regional countries that are home to conflict at the moment. And that's where, I walked in and started looking into how on earth can I fly to these countries? How do I get a ticket to Afghanistan? Because that's where the airlines were.
No apologies. That's made sense to me. You followed your instincts, and you went to Afghanistan, and you met one of my old buddies, Tim Page. I was very happy to see that he was your inspiration. You right that it sounded so Tim. He said, write about the humanity, not the bang bang. And that seems to be your motto all the way through. So tell everybody about your decision to take on the most difficult, the most dangerous, and possibly the most obscure assignments you could find.
Well, to open with Tim Page, which was just a pure luck moment for me. I was this youngster. I just flown to Afghanistan on my vacation time, where the newspaper will publish my work if I can find anything worthy. I've never been anywhere like that before. I'm very well aware. I'm nervous that I'm going to be taken as a total rookie, because this is the first time, I spent my whole life dreaming of being in with all the real correspondents, the real journalists there. And I get to this sort of hotel where they all stay in Kabul, and I'm embarrassed, I want to prove how tough I am. And I'm just one of the guys. And I have this new flak jacket, which has never been worn. And I'm so desperate to prove myself, and I go off to interview Tim Page because a press officer at the UN had suggested this was a good interview to do. I was such a rookie. I flew into Kabul. It was actually Eid, so of course I could get nothing done for a few days. And so I was trying to figure out what to do. And I went. I did this story about kids who were flying kites that had been given out by the UNHCR. And then the next day I went off to interview Tim Page. And I had read about this unbelievably brave combat photographer. I just thought he was going to be super macho. And what he said was the absolute opposite, and it was funny because only someone like him could speak with that kind of authority and say, he just started sort of riffing and talking, and he talked about Afghans and how little we know about them. And I realized as I was talking to him that I didn't know anything about Afghanistan or its people at all. I knew about the history of the war there. I knew, like we were coming up to the elections. I was looking at like we would eventually end up with the surge. And so he was just like asking perfectly inquisitive, curious questions that a journalist should be asking themselves. And it was amazing. And I was kind of given, he didn't mean it as like a telling off. He was just sort of talking and critiquing media. And I recognized myself in what he was critiquing. And I was astonished. And so I took it very, very much to heart. And it really, really followed me. And everything he told me that day as a youngster proved right, throughout every conflict zone I ended up in.